In this video, we're looking at one of the most feared responses to the Ruy Lopez, the Berlin defense, played by the Grandmaster who made the opening what it is today, Vladimir Kramnik. The first opponent is Grandmaster Victor Bologan, and he starts e4. Kramnik replies e5, and white attacks the pawn with knight f3. Black guards it with knight c6, and white plays the Ruy Lopez with bishop b5, undermining the pawn's defense. In response, Kramnik plays knight f6, the Berlin defense. Black develops a piece while attacking the e4 pawn. The Berlin is known as a solid and defensive opening, usually leading to a quick endgame. That's what happens in this one, as white castles, allowing black to take the pawn on e4. White follows with d4, trying to entice black into capturing to open the e-file so that he can place a potent pin on the knight to its king. Black avoids this, dropping the knight back to d6 with an attack on the bishop, who swipes the knight on c6. Now black could recapture with the b-pawn, but after white would take on e5, which would force the knight to move, white would have a very good position thanks to his lead in development. So black captures with the d-pawn, opening up his pieces, and white captures on e5, which forces the knight to move. It jumps to f5, which opens the queens to one another. White takes on d8, and black recaptures with the king, leading us into the famous Berlin endgame. White has a pawn majority on the king side, 4 versus 3, and black has doubled pawns. In compensation, though, black has the bishop pair. To start things off, white develops his knight to c3. Kramnik maneuvers his knight to e7, looking to place it somewhere where it can pressure white's pawn. White shifts his rook over to e1, and black moves the knight to g6. White's h3 gives the king a flight square, and black plays h6, guarding the g5 square from white's pieces. White's a3 is met by bishop d7 developing, and white brings his bishop out to e3. b6 opens the b7 square, which the black king would later run to, and white slides his other rook over to d1, indirectly looking at the king, who immediately gets out of the way to c8. In the spirit of the endgame, white begins advancing his king, and black develops his other bishop to e7. White centralizes his knight on e4, and black centralizes his rook on e8, building up pressure on the e5 pawn. In light of this, white drops his bishop back to d2 so that once black moves his bishop out of the rook's way, white can defend his pawn with bishop c3. Black follows with c5, gaining space while opening the square for his bishop, and white makes progress on the other end with g4. His plan will involve pushing his 4-on-3 pawn majority to try to create a passed pawn on the king side. Kramnik lifts his bishop to c6, dominating the long diagonal. White advances his king to g3, and black moves his to b7. After white pushes h4, black plays f6. Now, it looks like this pawn is pinned to the knight, but white could actually take on f6. This would lead to some complicated lines where black gets the knight, but white could counter with h5 before taking the pawn on g7, which would be dangerous. Instead, white opts for clarity, as he just pushes h5, hitting the knight, but allowing black to win a pawn. Black captures on e5, leading to an exchange of bishop for knight, and black ending up a pawn, but this being a slightly weak, isolated pawn. White looks to make use of his kingside space, as he jumps his knight to h4, looking at g6. Black moves his other rook from a to d8, and after white takes it, he recaptures with the rook. White's knight b6 attacks the bishop, who jumps to d6. White decides to take it, eliminating black's bishop pair, but undoubling his pawns once black recaptures. Then white plays the clever f4. Were black to take it, then white would recapture, getting a very active king. He could follow with moves like knight e7, cutting off the black rook, followed by walking his king up to munch on some kingside pawns. Back to the game, Kramnik avoids all of this by instead pushing his pawn to get a potent passed pawn. Still, white has a 3-on-2 majority on the king side as he pushes f5, sneaking up on the other side of the board. Black advances d5, assisting his pawn, and white quickly makes use of the freed up square on e5 with his knight. Black's rook e8 attacks it, and white defends it with his active king. Black starts bringing his king into the action, and white pushes c3 to hinder black's pawn advances. Black drops his bishop out of the knight's eyes, which allows him to push d4 without fear of losing the pawn's defender. Then white pushes b4, undermining the black pawn chain. Now Kramnik goes for it as he pushes the d-pawn, which supports his e-pawn's way forward. White takes it, and black recaptures, getting a weakness on d4, which white immediately targets with his rook. Yet black lets the pawn go as his e-pawn marches another step. White takes d4, winning back the pawn, but leaving black with one and only one move to win the game. Can you find black's winning move? With the e-pawn so close to promotion, it is integral to black's winning strategy. The move Kramnik plays to seal the deal is e2. White has no way to stop the pawn. Black's bishop covers e4, and the pawn itself covers the d1 square, so there's nothing the rook can do. White's best choice would be knight d3, and just to give up the knight for the pawn after it would promote. In the game, white plays rook c4 instead, maybe trying to get to the back rank. But black just advances his king to d6, adding an attacker to the knight, which could be taken were white to drop his rook. White hopelessly goes back to d4, giving another check, and after black blocks with his bishop, white resigns the game. His only way to stop the pawn would be with his knight, but at the end of this, black would emerge up a piece, which is a decisive material advantage. The next opponent is Super Grandmaster Levon Aronian, and he meets the Berlin defense with d3 defending his pawn from the knight's attack. Kramnik develops his bishop to c5, and after white takes the knight on c6, he recaptures with the d-pawn. This hangs the pawn on e5, but white cannot take it because black would play queen d4, forking the knight, and the f2 pawn thanks to the battery. So white castles instead, defending his pawn, and black lifts his queen to e7, defending his pawn. h3 gives luft while stopping his knight from getting pinned by the black bishop, and in aggressive fashion, black shifts his rook to g8, not castling, but instead preparing to launch his g-pawn forward. White quickly gets his king off the g-file, and black advances his knight towards the enemy king, while opening both his queen and the f-pawn. White's c3 looks to fight back in the center, and black launches his g-pawn. This, however, allows white to take the pawn on e5 with his knight, opening an attack on black's knight by his queen. And black can't recapture the knight, which would have worked a move ago, because the pawn would block his queen's defense of his knight. Kramnik isn't worried about a pawn though, as he strikes with g4. White counters in the center with d4, pushing the bishop back to d6. Now black is thinking about taking on h3, which would then threaten the g2 pawn with the rook's support. So white plays g3 in an attempt to close the king side. Black can't take the pawn on h3 anymore because he wouldn't have a subsequent threat and his knight would be hanging. But he can take the knight on e5, winning back the pawn once white recaptures and he takes it with his queen. White jumps his queen to d4, looking for a queen trade, but black says no, dropping his queen back to e7. With white's queen no longer pinning the pawn, black is actually threatening to take on h3. So white pushes the pawn, closing things down. Black hits on the other end with c5, and white sidesteps his queen to c4, where she gets struck again by black's bishop. The queen moves to b5, forking the king and the pawn, but black defends both with c6, while kicking the queen back to a4. Kramnik proceeds with the only move to gain an advantage here, f5. The idea is to get rid of the e-pawn. For example, were white to take it, black would sacrifice his knight on g3, and after white would take back, with the white pawn out of the way, the bishop could go to d5 with check. Not only that, but the e-file would also be opened up, and so too would the second rank. So after the white king would move, the black queen would jump to e2, and white would be toast. To stop the checkmate on g2, white could try rook f2, but queen e1 check would force the rook back, and queen takes g3 would be checkmate. Back to the game. White plays bishop g5 instead, hitting the queen, and Kramnik just takes it, sacrificing the exchange. White takes back, and black doesn't even take the pawn, but uses this extra time to push his f-pawn to bust open the white king side. White quickly retreats his queen to defend, but it's a little late for that now, as the final black piece emerges with the rook attacking the enemy queen. After she sidesteps to c1, black snatches the pawn on g3, and white cannot recapture because black would take back with a fork on the king and the rook. So he develops his knight to a3 instead, but what's that knight gonna do all the way on over there? Who knows? Black's rook jumps to d3, looking to swing over once the pawn's out of the way. White tries to get rid of it, the rook, before black plays the marvelous move, bishop d5. This opens the queen's path to e4, and there would be several lines where white to take the bishop, but they would all lead to checkmate, starting with queen e4 check. One possibility could be king g1, which would be met by a pawn capture on f2, after which the king would recapture, before black would swing his rook over to h3, threatening the unstoppable and devastating rook h2 check. White could try rook g1, but black would follow with rook h2, and the queen's got g2 covered, so after the rook would block, which is forced, black would finish white off with rook takes g2, followed by king f1 and queen e2 checkmate. Back to the game. Instead, white plays f3, defending his pawn, but really his position was already hopeless. Black takes the pawn, but this blocks the diagonal towards the king, so white takes the bishop. Instead of queen e4, black jumps his queen to e2, threatening a couple of checkmates. Yet white shifts his rook over to e1, pinning the black queen to its king. Did Kramnik miss something? No, but there's only one move that wins the game on the spot. Can you find black's checkmate in 5? The white king is surrounded, and the two black pawns are a little too close for comfort. The move Kramnik plays to put the white king out of his misery is g2 check. Now white has two choices here. Going to g1 would be met by f2, forcing the king back to h2. Then black wouldn't take the rook, but he would promote his g-pawn. White would be forced to take it, and again black wouldn't take the rook, but he would promote his other pawn instead. It wouldn't really matter to what, but the knight is cool, and it would double check the king, forcing him to h1, where he would get checkmated by the queen. Otherwise, the other option after g2 check would be king h2. Black would promote to a queen, giving double check, which would force white to take it. Before black would play f2 check, pushing the king to the corner. Rook h3 check would come next, and the king would go to g2, where he would be finished off by the second pawn promoting to a queen with double checkmate. The third opponent is Grandmaster Laurent Fressinet, and he also meets the Berlin defense with d3 defending his pawn. Kramnik develops his bishop to c5, and after white's c3 fighting for central squares, both sides castle their kings to safety. Black follows with d6, opening his other bishop, and white plays h3, guarding the g4 square. Black maneuvers his knight to e7, looking to reroute it towards the king side, but with d4's defense diminished, white takes the opportunity to strike with pawn to d4. Black drops his bishop a square, maintaining the central tension, and white develops his bishop to d3. Undevelops. Black places his knight on g6, eyeing up key kingside squares, and white centralizes his rook on e1. Black's c5 forces white's hand in the center, and he decides to capture on e5, before black recaptures with the pawn. White develops his knight to a3, next looking to reroute it to a more active square. and black lifts his queen to e7, preparing to swing his rook over to d8. In anticipation, white gets his queen off the file, moving her to c2. Kramnik leaps his knight to h5, pretty much guaranteeing a knight of his landing on f4. After white's bishop g5 attacking the queen, he calmly plays f6, kicking the bishop back to e3, before he jumps his knight from h to f4. There's no point in giving up his bishop for the knight, because black would just replace it with another knight. So white saves his other bishop from the attack, dropping it to f1. Black shifts his king to h8, getting out of any potential checks along the diagonal, and white activates his rook from a to d1. Black brings out his final minor piece with bishop e6. Now at some point, black may have ideas of sacrificing something on h3, so white plays king h2 to put a stop to these altogether. Black fires out f5, trying to get an open file for his rook. But this leaves the e-pawn undefended, so white takes the knight, prompting black to recapture with his other knight, leaving the e-pawn's defense. Then white jumps his knight from the rim to c4 with a tempo on the black central pawn. Kramnik drops his bishop to c7, defending the pawn, and even though there's two attackers, white always has discovered attack possibilities with his bishop. So white continues his knight's journey with knight e3 attacking the f5 pawn. This prompts black to take on e4, and white recaptures with the queen. Now black plays a stunning move here, and its idea revolves around the misplacement of white's queen. You can forgive white for missing the move too, because it's a crazy combination that starts with knight takes h3. White doesn't have to take back, but black just won a pawn and is threatening the f2 pawn as well. So white just grabs it, leaving his knight on f3 loose, which black takes with his rook. What black foresaw was that were white to take the rook, then black could play e4, giving a discovered check while attacking the queen with his pawn. White sees this one, and he moves his rook to e2, defending his f-pawn. But the damage has been done, with white's kingside shattered and black up a pawn. Kramnik swings his other rook over to f8, doubling up on f2. White lifts his bishop to g2, attacking the rook, but offering the pawn on f2, which black takes. This leads to an exchange of rooks before white grabs the pawn on b7 with his queen. Black's e4 opens a discovered check on the king, which white's king dodges, going to h1. Black's e-pawn is hanging though, and to avoid any pins on his bishop to his queen, black drops his bishop back to g8, which also defends his back rank. White can and probably should take the pawn, but he decides to jump his knight to g4, hitting the black rook, who shifts over to e2, defending his pawn enough to avoid losing it. White moves his queen to c8, pinning the bishop, and black plays h5, giving his king a flight square while hitting the knight. White counters with bishop f1, and black lets his rook go as he snatches the knight on g4. White takes the rook in exchange before black jumps his queen to e5, creating a brutal battery that threatens checkmate on h2. Now white's best bet here is unfortunately giving up his queen for the bishop, but that would be an admission of defeat. So he moves his king to g2, desperately trying to run away. Still, black has a way to force checkmate here. Can you find black's winning move? The white king is in a perilous place, and the rest of his pieces, in particular the queen, are nowhere near to defend. The move Kramnik plays to exploit this is queen h2 check. White's only move is king f1, and after black plays e3, white resigns the game. Black is threatening two checkmates, one on h1 and one on f2, and there's absolutely no way to stop both. The penultimate opponent is Grandmaster Yusuf Atabiev, and he meets the Berlin defense by capturing the knight on c6. Black takes back with the d-pawn, opening up his pieces, and white plays d3, defending his pawn. Bishop d6 prepares to castle. Yet white plays h3, and black flips the script as he develops his other bishop to e6, meeting white's knight c3 with queen e7, opening the gates for a long castle. White, in wanting to avoid anything too sharp, doesn't castle kingside, but lifts his queen to e2, planning to take his king in the same direction as black. Black castles long, and white plays bishop d2. Once black plays h6, defending that square from enemy infiltration, white castles queenside. Both players do something Ben Feingold would be proud of, shifting their kings over to the b file. Black centralizes his other rook on e8, and white pushes g4, gaining space on the king side. Kramnik drops his bishop back to c8. This opens up the e6 square, and after white swings his rook over to g1 to support his pawn storm, black drops his knight to d7, beginning a maneuver towards that square. White takes inspiration with a knight maneuver of his own, returning his knight to d1, and black moves his knight to c5, a square away from its target. Knight e3 is met by knight e6, where it hits vulnerable squares in white's territory, before white jumps his knight to an advanced square on f5, where it hits the black queen. She drops to f8. Now, with most of white's pawns on light squares, black may play bishop b4 in an attempt to trade off white's good dark squared bishop. To avoid this, white drops his queen to e1, fighting for the b4 square. Black pushes his pawn to f6, supporting his e-pawn, which allows his bishop to move away from its defense. Once white plays h4, preparing a kingside breakthrough, black lifts his bishop to c5. White follows with h5, with the idea of eventually placing a knight on g6. Kramnik, however, isn't really worried about these ideas, as he starts to turn his full attention towards the queenside, where the white king is located. He lifts his queen to f7, and after white plays rook g3, black boosts his b-pawn to b5. White drops his knight to g1, preparing to reroute it towards the queenside, and black drops his bishop to b6, making way for his c-pawn. White's knight e2 is followed by c5. White slides his rook over to f1, looking for an f4 pawn break, and black places his bishop on b7, staring down the long diagonal. White's knight c1 protects his king, and black lifts his rook to d7, preparing to double up on the semi-open d-file. White moves his knight to h4, looking at g6, and black shifts his other rook over to d8. White follows with bishop e3, indirectly looking at the black bishop, and black offers the exchange as he pushes c4. White takes it, and black recaptures with the pawn before white slots his knight into g6, where it aims to support an f4 pawn advance. Kramnik brings his knight into the attack as it jumps to c5. The d3 square is under fire multiple times, so white lifts his queen to e2, defending it. Black takes on d3, white recaptures, and black slots his rook into d4. White fights back with f4, and black takes it. White recaptures with the knight before black pushes b4, opening this diagonal, which his queen will soon make use of. White moves his other rook over to e3 because he plans to move his queen to f3 and his knight to e2, but he doesn't want to hang his pawn on d3. Black moves his queen to d7, and after white plays queen f3, black swoops his queen to a4, drawing near the enemy king. White's knight f to e2 hits the rook, and black surprises white by taking the pawn on d3 with his rook. White takes it with the knight, and black takes back with his other rook. Black got a knight and a pawn for the rook, but not only did he remove a key defender of the white king, namely the knight, but his pieces are all primed for the attack. Meanwhile, white can't take the rook because black would play bishop takes e4, hitting the queen and the rook, which would be pinned to the king. So white instead jumps his knight to g3, defending his pawn, enabling him to take the rook. Kramnik lifts his bishop to a6, defending the rook, while threatening the dangerous rook d2, which threatens not only the rook on f1 by the bishop, but a checkmate in 2 by way of queen c2 and queen takes b2. In light of this, white plays b3, pushing the queen to a3. Black is still threatening rook d2, and white still can't take the rook because were he to do that, black would take back with the bishop, pushing the king to a1, before taking the pawn on b3 with the knight, thanks to the pin on white's pawn, and this would be checkmate. Back to the game. So to try to get rid of black's powerful rook, white plays rook d1. And this would stop black's attack, if not for one move. Can you find black's one and only winning move? To find the move, you need to notice that the b pawn is pinned by the queen to the rook behind it. The move to exploit this, the move Kramnik plays, is knight a4. This threatens a checkmate on b2, and however white tries to stop it, he'll run into trouble. Taking the knight would leave the rook on e3 free to take, with a skewer on the knight, which would leave it falling next. Otherwise, there are several ways for white to try to defend. Queen e2 would be just one example, which would be followed by a capture on d1, forcing the white queen to leave the defense of b2, and that would be checkmate. There's other ways too, but they really aren't any better. So for that reason, after black's knight a4, white resigns the game. The final opponent is Super Grandmaster Alexander Grischuk, and he meets the Berlin with the most popular move, which is castling. The players play the moves that lead us into the Berlin endgame, and after the queens are exchanged, white develops his knight to c3. Kramnik develops his bishop to d7, and white's h3 is met by h6, both moves guarding squares from enemy minor pieces. White slides his rook over to d1, pinning the bishop, so black sidesteps his king to c8. White gains space on the queen side with a4, and black stops further expansion with a5. White's b3 looks to fianchetto the bishop on b2, and black plays b6, freeing the square for his king. White places his bishop on b2, and black drops his knight to e7 in order to reroute it, where it can put more pressure on white's position. White follows with rook d2, looking to double up rooks on the d-file. Kramnik advances his pawn to c5, gaining space, but this leaves the d5 square a little loose, so white drops his knight to e2 with an idea to push c4 and then maneuver his knight to d5, defended by his pawn. Black places his knight on g6, pressuring e5, and white slides his other rook over to d1, doubling up on the bishop, so it moves out of danger to e6. Then white proceeds with c4, and after black develops his bishop to e7, white jumps his knight to c3, getting it ready to go to d5. Black's king b7, connecting the rooks, is followed by knight d5, and black slides his rook over to d8. White takes the bishop on e7, opening the rooks to one another, and black exchanges a pair of them off. Once white recaptures with the knight, black takes back the knight on e7, and white drops his knight to f1, looking to reactivate it to a more active square. Black drops his king to c8 to support his rook onto d8 to challenge the open file. White's f3 opens a square for the king to get centralized, and black pushes g5, gaining space. Still, this weakens some squares on the king's side, and white jumps his knight to g3, looking to immediately exploit them. Kramnik swings his rook over to d8. White takes it, and black takes back with his king. White advances his king to f2, and black plays bishop f5, looking to jump to c2 and eat up all of white's pawns. White just takes the bishop, and black recaptures with the knight. White follows with g4, kicking the knight to d4. This attacks the pawn on b3, which is impossible to save, so white takes the knight, and black recaptures, getting a valuable passed pawn. White quickly moves his king to e2 to get in front of the pawn, and black advances his king to d7. White's king d3, attacking the pawn, is followed by c5, defending it. White's king e4 is met by the only winning move, king e6. This puts white in a position where he can't really move anything. The king can't leave the pawn's defense, and most of his other pawns can't move without getting eaten up. This leaves white with one move, which is f4. Black takes it, which is again the only good move, and white takes back with the king. Now black has only one move that wins here, for the third time in a row, but this time I'll let you have a chance to find it. Can you find black's best move? Now white's king is responsible for one too many things, namely defending the e5 pawn and stopping black's pawn from promoting. This is in fact too much, and the move Kramnik plays to exploit this is d3. White must run his king to stop the pawn, and black eats up the free e5. White takes on d3, allowing black's king to jump to f4. White can't save his pawns, as he desperately drops his king to defend. Black's king g3 is followed by king e3. After black takes on h3, white tries king f4 to try to corner the black king. Black moves his king to h4, and white's king has to budge, since he has no other moves, so he goes to f5. After king g3, white resigns. Were the white king to move, black would just pick up the pawn on g4 before easily escorting his pawn to promotion. The only other thing white could try would be g5, but black would just push h5, and the pawn would inevitably get to the end. If ever white tried to win the pawn on f7 before promoting his own pawn, black would move his king to g4 to win the white pawn, which means white just has no options. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.